Hey friends, welcome back to Huge Head Studio. My name is Robbie, and I want to start this video by apologizing for what I made this week, because it is, unsettling, to say the least. It is summer, which means the ice cream man is prowling the neighborhoods, and it made me think about those classic Spider-Man and Tweety Bird and SpongeBob Popsicles with the gumball eyes that were supposed to look like this guy, but they always ended up looking more like this. I grew up as a fan of SpongeBob, which might explain a lot, but my kids have become big fans as well, so I'd already been thinking about making a weird SpongeBob sculpt. But once I remembered these disappointing little popsicles, the idea just got weirder, and I decided to make an uncomfortably realistic SpongeBob Popsicle. And man, I don't know how I feel about it now that the creepy little thing is done and just staring at me, but you'll see that later. But for now, let's just enjoy the process, at least until his beady little eyes start creeping up the channel. For the base of this questionable sculpt, instead of making an armature wire skeleton like I usually do for all of my other figures, I used a sheet of balsa wood to create the structure because it's light and it's sturdy and it can be cut relatively easily with an X-Acto blade. And because I had some in my desk already, so that's the real reason I used it. I then covered the wood in a few layers of this glittery gray Sculpey 3 until it felt thick enough, and then I mapped out the face with a set of pre-baked eyes and a quick doodle, so he's currently Doodle Bob. After that, I cut out the mouth, and then I used a plethora of different sized ball styluses to poke in all of his pores, using the biggest first so that he starts to look like the cartoon. I used the handle of the tool to rough up the edges of the rectangle so it wasn't so uniform and to look more like the rippled edges of both the character and the popsicle. Then, as the first step in the journey toward making our SpongeBob look uncomfortably realistic, I added a lot more pores at smaller sizes, trying to make it look less cartoony and more like one of those round yellow Potter sponges. To make the pores look less uniform, I dipped an old brush in rubbing alcohol and brushed it back and forth over the entire surface using medium pressure. The alcohol does some sciencey things and then melts the surface of the clay slightly, which helps it blend and knock down and spread the rims of the pores. I threw it in the oven to bake and lock in the progress, but quickly realized that just cutting through the clay in the mouth wasn't going to be good enough, so I slowly and annoyingly Andy Dufresne'd my way through the layers of the balsa wood until the mouth finally felt deep enough. I drew a little circle and then cored it out even further, which took us all the way through the wood base to the clay on the other side, but that should now leave enough room to add the uvula. So I slapped on and blended in a strip of clay to cover the wood edges and to make the mouth look softer, and then added said uvula before smashing in another ball of clay for the tongue. I shaped the ball to actually look like a tongue and then poked at it with a wire brush to give it some tonguish texture, and then brushed on some rubbing alcohol to blend it down just like I did with the pores. With that done, we're ready to make SpongeBob's buck teeth, so I took a few pieces of this semi-translucent Super Sculpey and cut them to shape, and then just kind of rolled them gently in my fingers to round off the edges to make them look like teeth. I then put a fresh strip of clay into the mouth to act as the gums and to give me a place to shove the teeth into, which I did with this set of bottom teeth that I made off screen. I blended the gum layer onto the teeth to make sure that they were stuck in and secure, and then used a blade to cut away the excess to make the gum to tooth connection look more believable, and then repeated the process with the two buck teeth on the top of the mouth. With the teeth in place, I'm ready to add the lips, which I think is where the unsettling aspect to the sculpt makes its first appearance. SpongeBob doesn't really have lips, he just has a black line for a mouth, so it seems like once you start adding extra details to a cartoon that they don't already have, everything starts to get weird. Especially once I added all the texture to the lips, it really started to transform the goofy, toothy grin into something a little more icky. There's just something about it I really can't put my finger on, but it makes me uncomfy. Like, somehow we went from SpongeBob to John Waters. After that, I added his little cheek bumps just to try to make sure that it reads like SpongeBob, and then I repeated the steps with the pores by poking them in with a ball stylus before smoothing them out and blending them down with a brush and alcohol. Next, I added a roll of clay around the eyes to start his eyelids. But this is not just a realistic SpongeBob, it's an uncomfortably realistic SpongeBob, which means I'm not shooting for what SpongeBob's eyes may look like if he lived in our world, but more like what SpongeBob's eyes would look like if he came from Ren and Stimpy's universe, and then lived in our world. And it's not good, if you were wondering. They wouldn't look good. Also, Ren and Stimpy, like, what was that? Anytime I think the stuff my kids watch is weird, I look back to what I watched as a kid, and then I understand why my generation is the way it is. Anyway, I decided I wanted my SpongeBob Popsicle to be melting, so I tried to add a bunch of drips by sticking on little balls of clay and then blended them in to resemble melting drops of ice cream. My goal was to just have the left side melting, maybe as a way to explain why his eyes are uneven, but in reality it just looks like I covered SpongeBob in a bunch of skin tags. But you know what? We're rolling with it. Finally, I'm ready to add his nose, so for stability I added a bit of bacon bond, which is also known as Sculpey glue, and then a bit of wire to the sculpt, and then shoved the nose onto the wire. I then made some nostrils for a little extra realism, which just doesn't feel right. Then I blended the seams with a dash of liquid Sculpey. Finally, I added some dimples or pores or whatever you want to call them, which completes the sponge, and now I'm ready for his clothes. For the clothes, I'm switching to a different clay, and let me show you why with this comparison of this glittery Sculpey 3 and a harder Sculpey 3 and Super Sculpey. The glittery Sculpey 3 has a soft texture, more like original Sculpey, so it's real squishy, while the harder white Sculpey 3 has more of a medium softness, which holds its shape better, but still not as well as the harder Super Sculpey. So for the clothes, I want something that will blend easily while still holding its shape. The softer clay may not hold an edge as reliably, and the Super Sculpey is just a little too hard to look like cloth, and it will work better for his belt, so the medium hardness is the way to go. I rolled the clay out into a sheet with my pasta maker, and then I attached it to the body with the help of some bacon bond, and then smoothed it around the bottom as much as I could, kind of like wrapping a cake with fondant. I then wrapped another strip of the same clay around the body and blended the lower half of the strip down so that the top half of the strip creates his pant line. I used a smaller strip of the Super Sculpey to make a belt, and then I switched back to the white Sculpey 3 to add some belt loops. Once those were secure, I made his necktie and then covered it with some little white triangles before cutting away the excess and blending the tops of the triangles into the top of the shirt to create his collar. I then added some more drips, which still look like skin tags to the clothing, and then I finished off the sculpt by squirting on little globs of liquid Sculpey to try to add to the melting look, and then threw it in the oven to bake one last time. Once it was baked and cooled, I decided I wanted to keep the look of the teeth, so to protect them from paint, I used this liquid mask and applied a ridiculous amount to the teeth to make sure that they were good and protected. Once the mask was dry, I gave the whole sculpt a base coat of brown, so now he looks like a candy bar or a burnt sponge. Or a turd. Anyway, I started the paint job by giving his eyes a coat of white, and then I used my airbrush to give the eyes a bit of shadow, and then a bit of red, because this uncomfortably realistic SpongeBob Popsicle is unwell. I used some round cookie cutter tools to scratch in little circles into the paint as a marker for where I wanted the iris to go, and then I added some red veins to the eyes because, I don't know man, it seemed like a good idea at the time, but looking back, none of this was a good idea. He won't stop staring at me, and I have no idea what to do with it now. I'm afraid if I throw him in a closet, he'll reappear on my desk the next day. Anyway, I give the irises a bright coat of blue and added some little details before dabbing on some black pupils. I temporarily considered making the pupils bigger as a play on the Popsicle's black gumball eyes, but honestly I don't know if that would have made it more or less unsettling. Once the eyes were done, I moved on to the mouth, adding the necessary reds and pinks to the parts of the mouth that are red or pink because I'm just brilliant like that, and then reapplied the brown base coat as needed to cover the airbrush overspray so that I could apply the first coat of yellow, which on top of the brown just looks green. But don't worry, this is just an underpainting and we're going to build up the yellow little by little as it's just naturally a transparent color. We're going to use that to our advantage to create a bit of color variation throughout the sponge so it's not just one solid flat coat of yellow. For the top yellow layers, instead of brushing the color on in strokes, I dabbed it on to create some texture with the paint to try to add some more of that rough spongy feel to the surface. For the last yellow layer, I mixed a light pale yellow to accent and highlight the upper eyelids and the edges of the pores, which helps the pores pop a bit. It also breaks up the flat yellow color even further and creates a more splotchy surface, which just adds to the believability. I followed that up with doing the exact opposite by deepening the pores with some heavy browns to continue to push the texture of the skin, or sponge, or whatever you want to call it. I then added some more color to the lower eyelids, which made him look like he's got bags under his eyes and just drove home the point that this SpongeBob just ain't right. I then dabbed on a bit of red to his rosy little cheeks and his nose and then pulled the liquid mask back off the teeth before giving them a nice stain because nobody with eyes like that has pearly white teeth. To make the stain, I simply thinned out some brown and dabbed it onto the teeth near the gums, and then I used a dry brush to feather it out and then followed that with a thinned ochre color to add some more plaque or lingering Krabby Patty sauce because it just seems right on this gross little weirdo. With the teeth done, I moved on to his clothes by giving his shirt a solid coat of white, and then I built up the red of his tie with a handful of thin layers to give some depth to the color, starting with a crimson base coat and finishing with a bright true red. After that, I mixed up some raw umber with some raw sienna to make sure SpongeBob's pants were the right shade of brown, and then applied a glossy black for his belt. Once the clothes were done, all that was left to paint was the popsicle stick, so I applied a flat coat of a light popsicle stick brown and then wet blended a few different browns on top to create a wood grain look. I then applied a darker brown into the grooves that I'd carved into the clay earlier, which finally completed the paint job on this creepy little sponge. But in the end, I decided he wasn't quite creepy enough, and he needed some moisture. So I applied a few coats of a gloss varnish onto his eyes as well as the melting drips that are totally not skin tags to make them look wet. Finally, I squirted a glob of UV resin onto his bottom lip and cured it with the magical purple flashlight as it dripped to give him that Pennywise drool vibe, and with that, the uncomfortably realistic SpongeBob Popsicle is ready to... I have no idea. I don't know what he's gonna do. I hate this guy. As always, I hope you enjoyed this dumb and weird little project, and I hope you find him just as unsettling as I do. If you did enjoy the video, do me a favor and give it a like and subscribe to the channel if you want to keep up with whatever dumb idea I come up with next. But that about does it for now, so thanks for watching, and I will see you on the next one.